Okay, that's the recording started. A very warm welcome to session 2 of our Right Way Wicklow Libraries session. I am Sam Blake, as you know. For those guys of you who were with us last week, I know you were here and obviously caught up, but I'm just going to give a quick, very quick recap of what we did. But just to tell you a little bit about me, for those of you who are new in, I'm a writer. I live literally just down the road from Ballywaterham Library. It's my local library. And I am a crime writer. My latest book is called The Dark Room. Watch everything. My owl just fell off the shelf. Anyway, The Dark Room. There you go. That is the 5th book I've written. I wrote 3 police procedurals in the Cat Connolly series, which is just behind me there. And The Dark Room is a standalone. Keep Your Eyes on Me was the previous one. And in fact, actually, the quick plug, The Dark Room is only 99p on Kindle at the moment. So for those of you who have Kindles or just want to store it for later, I will be referring to it every now and again when I'm talking about characters and stuff like that. So it might be handy for you to have. So do download it. 99p, can't go wrong. So that's the advert over with. So last week we talked about really starting out and thinking about your idea and thinking about your story and what your story might be about. We actually wandered around all over the place because we were answering lots of questions too, which was wonderful. You had some really great questions. But basically, for you guys who are coming in fresh today, one of the things you want to think about is, what is your story? What is your story going to be about? And I always suggest to people trying to summarize it in just a few lines before you even start. So you just get a feel for what that story is going to be about. But this week, what we're going to do is we're going to be talking about sort of the next step on from there, which is writing the blurb and really building the scaffolding for your book, which is the sort of the plotting and planning stage. But one of the big things I wanted to talk to you about right at the start of this one was the whole fear of the blank page and the fear of rejection that can come up and can really inhibit people and stop people wanting to write. I run a writers group called Writers Inc. and we had a great session last night. This is one of the things that always comes up. We've got some new members who've just joined, and a lot of people feel that they're worried about starting to write. And when you dig into it and worry about why you're nervous about getting going, it tends to be that fear of rejection, that fear of somebody not liking your work, or just fear generally. And so one of the things I wanted to say to you right at the start of this is, don't worry about that, because nobody needs to see what you're writing. Okay, the first draft of anything, for me as well, and I'm going to explain to you the various elements of plotting and planning and bits and pieces of the work I do to build that scaffolding before I even start. But that first draft I write, even with all the work I do in advance, is always an absolute hot mess. It is a complete disaster. It is not something anybody should ever see. So what you are trying to do really in your first draft of anything is just find the story, find out what's going on in the story, who the characters are and what happens, and sort of get into that story mode. And as I say, nobody ever needs to see it. So you don't have to worry if it's terrible. When you sit down, if you find that you're completely put off by the blank page, or you suddenly discover that actually 3 loads of washing and a floor needs hoovering instead of actually sitting down to write, just sort of try and access the bit of your mind that might be worrying about the outcome, and see if you can knock it on the head, because really nobody needs to see it. The key for you now at this point is just try and get those words on the page, and they will be a mess, and that's completely fine. Everybody's first drafts are a mess, and when you go back and look in, say, libraries, or I think we did an article on writing.ie about pens the other day, and whether about writing in fountain pen, and there were samples of Stephen King's drafts, because he writes a lot in fountain pen, and some of the others, and they're all crossed out, and you'll see that in early drafts of Joyce and all the great writers. There's loads of crossing out, and on a computer we're doing lots of deleting, because that's really what you're trying to aim for, is that first hot mess, that first draft of trying to find out what the story is all about. So that's it. Feel the fear and do it anyway, is the moral for today. But one of the things that really helps in this whole process is, as I said, and we were discussing last week, trying to really think about what your story is about, and try and make a note, write a couple of lines about what that story is going to be, where it's going to go. There are many different types of writers. There are people who plot in detail before they even start writing, and there are people who what we call pantsters, who literally just start writing and see where it takes them. And often you don't know what sort of writer you are until you start. Some of you might feel, I have a great friend called Sarah Webb, who many of you probably know because she's quite local, who's written loads of books. And she has this theory that if you're a plotter, you're the type of person who tends to be very organised. And if you're going away on holiday, you're the person who's bought the tickets and you've packed the suitcase, and maybe the suitcase has been on the bed for a week before you've left, and you're popping bits into it because you've got that sort of organised mind. You know, you're the type of person that makes lots of lists and remembers to take the shopping list with you to the supermarket. If you're a pantster, you're the type of person who perhaps doesn't remember to take the shopping list to the supermarket, and doesn't worry about getting packed or any of those things before they go on holiday. They literally just chuck everything into a case and off they pop. They're quite relaxed about the whole thing. So have a think about what type of person you are and what makes you feel more secure. Some pantsters who try plotting find that, in fact, the plotting process takes the story away for them. And when they've written out the plot, it's like, why do I need to bother writing the story? Because I know what happens. So if you find that that's happening to you, then, try the other method. One of the things I always say to people is to try and listen to writers talking about the writing process as much as you can, because I literally, every time I listen to a writer speak about anything, I learn something new. And on writing.ie, on the Facebook page for writing.ie, we've got a whole series of videos that we've been doing, myself and my agent have been doing since the start of lockdown last year. So there's literally about 30 of them with really, really big name authors who all started from nothing, were all unpublished at one point and all had to write that first book. And it wasn't necessarily that first book that got published with a lot of them. But they talk about their process, and I find that fascinating because there is something that you can glean from every single one of them, literally nuggets of gold. And that's how I started how I've developed my writing process and how I approach a book and how I approach a story. It's literally listening to all the other people and cherry picking the bits that really work for me. When you're listening to somebody, they'll say something, you go, oh God, yeah, that's really great. Let's try that. And it's finding all those little nuggets of information and creating your own process that's really, really important. And you only really can create your own process by literally writing and trying and moving around and trying to find out what works and what doesn't. But as I say, those videos are really useful if you've got time to listen to them. My partner in Writers Inc. actually puts them on as a podcast. So she obviously has good Wi-Fi in her area, but if she goes for a walk, she'll listen to them rather than watching them necessarily. They're all on YouTube too for anybody who hates Facebook. So they're all accessible, and I highly recommend them. But for me, starting a book is all about building the scaffolding. And I write those few lines that I mentioned at the start just to give me a feel for what the book is about. It just gives me a sense of what I'm writing about. I'm thinking about location, perhaps thinking about a couple of characters. I'm thinking about what really happens in this story. Is it crime? Is it a romance? Is it historical fiction? What is it? What is it that I'm going to write? And then I would take that little paragraph and I'd write a slightly longer blurb. And this is something Sophie Hannah talks about. She has something she calls the gnocchi method. Gnocchi's this pasta which has got mashed potato in. I have never tried it. But she talks about that. And what she does is write a blurb before she begins a book. So she's writing a slightly longer version of that paragraph, which just tells her a little bit about where it's going. And it's much easier to fiddle around with that paragraph and have a think about it and leave it and go away and chew on it and think about your story when it's literally only a few lines than it is to try and wrestle with 100,000 words, which is what you're going to have at the end of this process. So I'd highly recommend trying to write a blurb before you begin. If you've already started and you're halfway through a book, then go back and think about what this book is about. Have I got that blurb? Is it right? Is it something that's really encapsulating the story? Is it something I want to read? Andrew Miller, in one of the interviews we did, talked about how a story needs to be original and fresh. And for a new author wanting to break out and actually get this book published, then being original and fresh is really important. But more important than all of that is finding the story. So literally writing that blurb is really, really vital. And then trying to work out whether you're a plotter or a pantster. And you can find that literally by writing a short story, by maybe writing 1,000 words on, whatever the idea is, and just seeing whether or not you can find your way through that or whether you actually need to make more notes. And I think instinctively we know how much work we need to put in beforehand, how much is plotting and how much is pantstering. There is a really good article on writing.ie that has a chart that I use for plotting that that I was going to link to. I'm going to try screen sharing in a minute, which is a big adventure for me because anything could happen. But that article is a Sam Blake article. I'll see if I can get David actually to send you an email about it. I think we include it in the emails for the last guys who came to the last session. But it's about it. Basically, I have this chart that I create, which is literally like a bar chart. It's columns across a word page. And as I'm planning out a book, I write that first bit of blurb, and then I think about what's going to go into each chapter. And what I do is create a grid of 30 of these little columns, because in my head, which is an entirely fictitious place, I tend to think in terms of a book being 30 chapters of about 3,000 words each, which would give me a 90,000 word first draft. Now, in fact, my chapters are never 3,000 words each. They tend to be 1,000 to 1,500 maximum. But it doesn't matter. Just for the purposes of plotting and planning at the start of the book, that 30 chapters gives me an idea about whether I've enough story for a book, whether there's enough happening. And it means that I can introduce characters, and I can literally, they're just notes on in each column. You know, certainly the Cat Connolly one was, you know, Cat Connolly finds bones was the notes in the first part of Little Bones. And I go through and I work out what's going to happen. And it, as I say, it's much easier to work at that level, and for me to plan out a bit about what's going to happen than it is to try and sit down and write a whole book, because I know if I tried to sit down from the start with no plan at all, I would wander around all over the place. So I like to be able to get the thing under control, I suppose, in that, using that chart. And it just helps me know where I'm going. And quite often there'll be blank columns because I don't know exactly what happens. And you want to leave room for the creativity. So even if you are a plotter, and I talk about plotting, it doesn't have to be like a detailed chapter by chapter, this is what's going to happen, you know, page on each chapter. It can be just a few words, which just give you a sense of where that chapter is going to go. In any chapter in a book, you need to decide what it is the reader needs to know at that point that's going to move the story forwards. And so each chapter has a purpose. It's in the book for a reason, and it's going to be moving the plot forwards. And obviously, if you can work that out beforehand, then it'll help you know where you're going. It's a bit like creating a roadmap, I suppose, in some ways. I like to have a concept or an image in my head of perhaps where the middle of the book is going, and it might be a scene that I can see that's in the middle of the book, or it might be a scene that's at the very end of the book. So I know where I'm aiming for. So even if my chapter notes are very sketchy and a bit hazy, I've got an idea about where that story is going. One of the key things is that stories about character, and I'm going to be talking a lot about character next week, but stories are all about characters, and story and plot are about the characters' reactions, their interactions, and how they react to each other and to situations they find themselves in. So understanding your characters is another sort of the next important thing in terms of building that scaffolding. And as I say, I'm going to be talking a lot about that soon. But think about who's in your story. Think about where your story is going to be set. I use something called Scrivener, which is just a tool. You can use Word, you can use anything, just to start compiling details about who is in the story, where the story is going to be set. I was talking last week about myhome.ie. I use that a lot because I like to have a visual image of where my story is actually happening, and people's houses are very important for me. I'm a very descriptive writer, so in things I'm looking for the dark room, and I've moved it already. So in the dark room, which you can see the house on the outside of the cover there, it's set in a country house hotel, and I wanted to get a clear idea of what that country house hotel looked like. So I based on somewhere I'd been, which is a place called Merchant's Manor in Falmouth, and there are photographs of that actually on the Sam Blake website, which I will see if I can share in a second, because those pictures give me a real good sense of what the place looks like. And I think it's really useful, because what you are trying to do as a writer is create a story which basically is lots and lots of pictures in your head. You're writing the words, which are then going to form pictures in your reader's head. And that visualization is really, really important. And I find it very, very helpful to have pictures of the characters, pictures of the locations. And they're all part of the scaffolding. They're all part of the work that I do before I even start a book. So I think I showed you last week, this is the storyboard for the dark room. You can see it there. There's all sorts of people you might recognise on there. That's actually where I was just opposite where I was sitting when I came up with the idea, and you can't see it very well here, but it's clear on the Sand Lake website. There is a tower just across the water there, which became, it's a ruin, and it became a key part of the story, which is about Hare's Landing, which is an entirely fictional country house hotel. Those pictures are all of Cornwall, where I came up with the idea, but then I moved it to West Cork and created a whole sort of world around that. But that's really what I want you to think about, and certainly this second session is all about. It's about thinking about those layers that go into your story and thinking about the scaffolding. Think of it literally as building a house, and it's you want to build good foundations and have some good poles up to support whatever walls you're going to be building. And if you've already started a story, or you're halfway through, or you're at the end of a first draft, look back and see, do you have those things in place? Who are these characters? What do we know about them? Are their names representative of them? As I say, I'm going to be doing much more on character next week, but character names are really, really important to show us what those characters are like. And they give you a really good sense of who those people are. So, for instance, somebody called Sebastian or Algernon is likely to be a completely different character from somebody called Reg or Wayne. So you can just even feel from those different types of names, the different types of people that they might be. So character names are very, very important. And as I say, it's part of this scaffolding that you're building. One of the things that popped up in one of the interviews we did on writing.ie was from Joanne Harris, and she was talking about just writing 300 words a day. So when you have the scaffolding built and you're getting into the stage of getting to start writing, try and set yourself achievable objectives. Joanne talks about literally writing 300 words a day, and that's really achievable. That's, if you write fast, that might only take you half an hour. If you want to spend longer on it, it can take as long as you like, but she tends to think in those terms. And then she knows she can do 300 words, and anything over that is a bonus. Because one of the other things that can hamper you in this writing process is, setting yourself objectives and then not necessarily achieving them. So a lot of people talk about writing every day and how important that is. And that can be great for some people, but it's not always achievable. It's not always possible. You're always, even as a professional writer, you tend to be fitting writing in around other things like this. And I was editing this morning, and I'm starting to think about new ideas for a new book. I haven't got any headspace for that just yet, but that's sort of out here on the edges. Obviously talking to you guys, doing a bit of editing, and it's all on borrowed time, and all the time you put into writing is going to be borrowed from somewhere. So try and set yourself achievable objectives that you can do, because the minute you start to feel like you're failing, then we get back into that fear thing going on, and you can find that books become much, much more difficult. I mean, they're hard enough, honestly, to write as it is. It is easy in some ways, in the sense that it's all about you putting the ideas down on the page, but it's not easy to learn all the techniques that need to go into making that great. And it's not easy to find the time, to get down and do what you do. But once you get into it and you start writing, and you've got these structures in place, the bits to give you that little bit of security to move you forwards, you'll find that actually you get into the zone. And once the creativity hits and things start to happen that you don't expect, that's when the magic really happens. And it's great fun, and you really, really start to enjoy it. So one of the things I wanted to share with you, so I'm shuffling all my papers here, was let's see if this works now, screen share. Where are we? It's a PDF I'm trying to share, so I don't know how that's going to work. Files, see if that works. No, it's down here. It's a thing called, oh, here we go. Is that going to work? No, I'm going to have to work on that one. There's I'll get David to email it all to you instead. I'm just trying to think where it would be. It's on writing.ie, and it's a page on writing.ie by a lady called Rose Doyle. Give me just 2 seconds, and I'll see if I can find it and screen share it that way, because my PDF issue is not going to work. Oh, here it is. Now, here we go. See if I can do it without losing you all. Now, screen share. There we go. Right, this is the one that's on writing.ie. Can you all see that? Somebody nod.
Yeah, I can see that.
Chat. Oh, David can, thank you. Right, so this is something that's on writing.ie, and it's an article by Rose Doyle. Can I put, yes, I think I can. Let me try and put this into the chat. Oh, we're getting really techie here. Where is the chat gone? David, can you do that? Do you know how to do that? Put
Yeah,
the URL into the chat.
of course. Yeah, let me have a go there.
You can fiddle around with that while I talk you through it. So basically, this is something that a lovely lady called Rose Doyle gave out in one of the very first Inkwell workshops that I did, and I found it immensely useful ever since. And basically, she takes you through 10 days of how to set up your book. So it's everything that I've just been saying there, but condensed into the 10 days. It's on writing.ie, and we can share a link with you as well, so you can find it again yourselves. But basically, what she's doing is suggesting that on day one, and obviously this doesn't have to be done over 10 days, but it just is a helpful structure. Write one sentence summarising what the book's about. That's what I was talking about last week to you. And then she says on day two, jot down the characteristics, names, age, and relationships of your major characters and repeat for the minor characters. Okay, so then again, this is a scaffolding that we're building the book. I should have said right at the start, it really helps if you've got a notepad or you set up a file especially for this and just put all these bits in together. I was doing an article for Writers Inc., which are our writing group the other day, Tuesday, about creating character Bibles, which is something I really should have done at the start when I started getting published, because you find that you have names that you really like and they tend to crop up repeatedly in books. So do keep some sort of chart or some sort of list of everybody who's going into your story. And if you do it now when you're starting out, it'll save you a whole ton of work later. I discovered that I've written a book called High Pressure, which is sort of my spare book, which is not under contract. It's just sort of lurking out there. There's a guy in it called Rob Power. And then I managed to use his the name again in Keep Your Eyes on Me, where there's a Lily Power. So then if High Pressure ever gets published, I have to go back to that and make sure that I have linked Rob and Lily so that they're actually cousins, obviously I've realised now since, and that it all makes sense. One of the things I like to try and do when I'm writing is to create a world that's the same world, so that if you read any of the Sam Blake books, that you'll recognise locations or characters or references from the other books, so that you literally feel like you're stepping into a whole world that's a complete world. And so therefore it doesn't make sense if you've got two people with the same name and there's no reference to them being related. So I think creating a character Bible and creating these sort of lists of names and things can be really, really useful. So day 3, Rose suggests note the locations and settings that will feature in your novel. And as I say, I use myhome.ie, and you can see on the storyboard, the light on it, you can't see anything. That's the hotel that became Hare's Landing. And somewhere down here, where's it gone? There's a houseboat. That's the boathouse. Where have we gone? Oh, I've got my hand over it. There's a houseboat, in fact, there. Because Rachel, my character, we only see the houseboat fleetingly in the dark room. It's right at the start, but Rachel lives on a houseboat, and I wanted to get an understanding of how a houseboat was configured in order to describe what happens when she is there. She's only there for probably half a chapter, but it's all part of my scaffolding. It's all part of this building. And when you have this scaffolding and you have these building bits in place, it gives you huge security to be able to write the story, because you can stop worrying about all of those details and you can literally get on with writing the plot and worrying about what actually happens to the characters in these places, without having to create the entire world at the same time, because our heads can only take so much at a go. So one of the things Rose says then on day 4 is define your character's goals, set up the plot and create the tension. Every character needs to have something hard to get. As I say, more characters next week. But the other thing you need to be thinking about, just in case you can't get to us next week, is that characters need to change as a result of your story. It's something that's really, really important, because without change, there is no story. So just have a think when you're creating the scaffolding and you're making your notes on your characters. What is it that happens to them? Carlo Gebler, I've made a DVD called the National Emerging Writer Programme, which actually now is all on YouTube, which obviously I would share too if I was able to. And Carlo talks about how Anna Karina at the start of the book that I've now I've lost the title of completely because I threw myself off there. Anna Karina is alive at the start of the book, and she is dead at the end. Now that's a big change for a character, but obviously we don't need to all go quite that dramatic. But what you need to be thinking about how your character is going to change, and I suppose this is why it's important to understand who they are at the start of the book and who they're going to be at the end of the book. What happens to them? What happens in that story? The National Emerging Writer Programme is all on YouTube. It's on the writing.ie YouTube page. And I think we shared that last week. I can't remember what links David had. It was actually not last week, it was last month. This is why I'm struggling to remember what we did. But we will make sure you get that again this week, hopefully, this month, I should say. As you can tell, I'm in the depths of editing at the moment, and the only thing I can focus on is what's happening in this story, and things like time just go out of the window. This will happen to you too in due course. So day 5, according to Rose Doyle, she suggests listing the obstacles that prevent the main characters from what they want, from getting what they want. These can be psychological, physical, or emotional. So have a think about those characters. Think about your story. Think about what it is they want and what's stopping them. That is basically the core of your story. It could be that they want to win the lottery. It could be that they, want to find love, or they want to find the most fantastic job ever, or whatever it is that they want. If it's crime, they might be detectives and they want to find the answer to the murder or the crime that they've discovered at the start of the book. Think about what it is that they want. And this is great forward thinking here from Rose. This is why I love this chart. It's well worth printing this off if you can. You'll find it on writing.ie. Plan the conclusion, okay? Make up the ending before you even start writing. Now, it might change. You're not held to this, but write a paragraph and put it over your desk. And that paragraph is the end of your book. So the goal is achievable. You've already got there before you've even started. That's why I like, when I start writing a book, to have that end scene in my head, to have a vision of where we're going to go. Where is that last scene going to play out? So in I think it's No Turning Back, the end scene is set in St Pancras Station, and I knew all the way through the book that end scene would be in St Pancras in London, but I had to work out how people got there and how it all played out in that environment. And in fact, I actually had to rewrite, because the first version of that first draft, when I was talking about the hot mess of the first draft that we're trying to achieve, the first ending I had on that book was complete nonsense. And it was really great, and it was very cinematic, but it really didn't make any sense. So I had to go back and then rewrite it. But that's the beauty of a first draft, that you can go back over and do that. But it still ended up in St Pancras Station. The story I'm editing at the moment, which is the book that will be out in January, I don't even know what year it is, 2022, is called Remember My Name. And I had a very, very clear end scene of that, which happens in a swimming pool. And I knew what happened in this pool room. And again, I had to get my characters to that point. And it can be quite instinctive, this whole writing process. It is very instinctive. And it's very much, all the magic happens in your subconscious mind. It happens in the bit that when you're just waking up or when you're going to sleep is when the best ideas come, and that's when your subconscious is busiest. Agatha Christie talked about coming up with ideas when she was doing the washing up, and that's those things we do. Like for me, it could be hoovering, it could be washing the floor, or doing the washing up. They're the things that you do automatically, and so you're busy. Your body's busy, but your subconscious mind then is off the hook to start doing its own thing too, and start creating. And that's when the creativity can really happen. So learning to listen to your subconscious mind and opening up to that sort of instinctiveness that comes when you're writing is really, really important. And everything when you're writing, when you're at this stage of getting started and you're writing your first draft, and it might be the first draft of the second book that you've written, or the third, but it's that learning to tune into your subconscious is absolute gold. Trust your subconscious mind. That is where the magic happens. So when you've written your conclusion, you've written your outline, and you've got an idea about where the story might go, then day 7 is to create a brief outline of the plot. And as I say, you can use the chapter table thing that I use. You can perhaps just write essentially a synopsis, which can be a one-pager of just how you see the plot panning out. And it doesn't have to be everything. It's not all the detail. It's just give you a sense of whether or not that story works. What actually happens in this story? What is the big event, the big conflict? What's the big turning point that's going to happen in the middle of the book? What happens to your characters? And then day 8, Rose suggests making a list of chapter headings, which again is what I was saying with that's my plotting table. What happens in each chapter? What is the major event that happens in that chapter? What's the thing the reader really needs to know about? And then, or perhaps maybe it's a linking chapter. What needs to happen in this chapter in order to make the next chapter happen? And then she says, set up hard copy files for each character and location. That's what you'll be doing. You might want to make a storyboard like I've got, or create, notes on each character. And as I say, this character Bible with all their names and their detail is really, really useful. And then on day 10, Rose says, write the opening paragraph. So that brings us back around to the start. So hopefully that will give you a bit of, let me see if I can get you all back again now. Stop sharing. You'll have that link and you can go back to that and use it as a guide and as a template. But the idea of this is very much to get that scaffolding built, to get a sense of where your story is going to go and who's in it. And as I say, be flexible. It's really important that any of this can change. Anything can happen along the way when you're writing. Something can happen you don't expect, and that's the best thing that can happen, because that means then that the story's taken over and your characters are taken over, and really, really go with the flow. So I can see some questions in the chat, and well, I think the questions, maybe they're chat.
I just put the link in, Sam, there for writing.ie.
Excellent. Oh, perfect. Well done, you. That's brilliant. Yeah, so you can find it there. So does anybody have any questions at this stage, or are you all blitzed? War and Peace, somebody said. Yeah, no, Anna Karina's actually now. She's probably in War and Peace too, but she's in Anna Karina as well, isn't she? I think that's the one where she dies. Sorry, I was thrown off. So does anybody have any questions at this point? We can do them. We can switch on cameras and microphones if you want to, or we can just put them into the chat. You might feel more comfortable doing that, because obviously we're recording it and people are going to watch back, and you might be in your pajamas, so you might not want to put your video on. If anybody has any questions, do feel free to throw them in. I find that Rose Doyle thing really, really useful. It just gives you structure. I think one of the things about writing a book is that you're creating this story and you're creating 100,000 words of something, and keeping it under control as you're going along is really important. And all of this building in advance is really, really useful. It just gives you a sense of where you're going and what you're doing. And even if you started and maybe I know some of you last month were saying that you were halfway through a first draft, or you were into a second draft, go back and see if you've got those bits in place, because sometimes you get a really good idea and you just start writing. But that scaffolding is the type of is the bit that really will help you through the process. You can find when you get into the middle of a book, we were talking about this the other day too, about somebody was saying last night actually that one of the things that was stopping them writing was fear of the middle slump that can happen. And often you do get a slump in the middle where you don't know where you're going and it's all getting a bit boring and you're just a bit fed up with the whole thing. And that really, it's important. This scaffolding will help you get through this slump in the middle. It'll help show you that maybe you need a bigger thing to happen. I was laughing with them last night and saying I was throwing a dead body at that point, because then everything gets going again, and you can move the story forwards and you get passionate about it. But that's the problem. If you're bored writing it, the reader, you can be sure, is going to be bored reading it, and you want to try and avoid that.
So Sam, we have a question there, Sam, from Alison. It would be great to have a tip when writing loosely on a family member's life, a grandmother, when relatives are still living. I feel very constrained by that. Thank you, says Alison.
Alison, are you writing? You're writing it loosely based on a family member's life. Okay, so you're writing fiction. I would try and fictionalize it as much as possible. One of the problems about writing about real people is that those real people might not like the way that they're portrayed, and that can result in a whole world of pain for many reasons. So I would try and take it a step away from that person's life. Absolutely use the period, use the world events or whatever that are around them, and maybe some of the events in their life. But try and make them as different as you can, because then you want to, I suppose, step into that fictional world. Actually, Carlo Gebler is brilliant on this. In the National Emerging Writer Programme, he talks about being hobbled by the truth. And quite often, if you base fiction on true events, what can happen is you get hobbled by the truth. And so you're trying to stick to the real events, and actually the fiction just wants to fly off and it wants to go into a different, maybe into a different direction or do something completely different. So open your mind. If you're already feeling slightly constrained by it, it's those true events that are hobbling you. And certainly if you can, I suppose, let it go. Try and make it into a different character. Absolutely be inspired by the past and inspired by her life, but write about somebody different. One of the ways to do that, in fact, is actually to change the sex of that particular character. I can imagine if you're writing about, if it's an Irish story and it's historical, I can imagine that could be tricky. But try and make her as different as possible, or change the period, or mix it up as much as you can, to try and take a step away from that, because the truth can actually constrain you, and you're always going to be worried about her reading and thinking and knowing it's her, or thinking that it's her. So I would try and take a step away from it as much as possible, and you can do that in that building process when you're creating the scaffolding. When you're thinking about names, maybe changing the location will help you hugely. If it's a rural location, maybe put it in the city. If it is set in Ireland, maybe set it in another part of the world. All of those things, things that you change, will help take you a step away from that true story. Because I can imagine, that would create an issue. And that's the same for people writing fictionalized memoir. It happens a lot, and it can be very tricky because you don't want the people, if the people are still alive, your representation of them can be different, especially if you're moving towards the fictional side of things, and it can get into a real mess and a real tangle. So just be inspired by those events, but try not to tie in too closely, and try and make the character as different as possible. So for instance, if it was based on your grandmother, if that character suddenly, maybe they were blind, your mum, sorry. Grandmother. So if you want to, make the character completely different, make them blind, make them, living in a different world, maybe that'll help, and see how you get on. So has anybody else any other questions? What stages are you at? Do you want to pop in just into the chat? Just give me an idea of where you are. If you're first draft, if you are first draft, just starting first draft, if you have a draft done, if you are, halfway through the second book, just fire it in there and give me an idea of where you are in terms of the scaffolding. Everybody's now paralysed. There we go. Oh, perfect. 2 chats into first draft. And Sue, have you got any sort of structure worked out already? Tell us if you... No. Good. Excellent. So hopefully this will be useful. Because that's the thing. When you come up with an idea, you get really excited and you start writing and you fly into it. And it's fantastic because it's all burning. The story's burning. But what can happen is then you fizzle out after chapter 3, or you fizzle out after chapter 5. And if you can get this a little bit of scaffolding, not a lot, but just enough to move it forwards, then that's really, really useful. Somebody's trying to get published, but trying to amassing the rejections come in. One of the most important things about the point where you're starting to submit is to make sure the book is ready before it goes. So Paul, make sure that you have taken it to the absolute nth degree, that you have perhaps written maybe, Little Bones, I'd say, had maybe 15 drafts. I don't know how many drafts you've been through, but that you have been over it and over and over it to make it the best that it can be. One of the things you're also looking at is to try and make sure that it's original and fresh, that it is an idea that nobody else has tried, because all ideas have been done, but you're coming at it from a slightly different angle. I'm trying to think of other reasons. The other thing about rejection is to make sure you're sending it to the right place, to make sure that the people you're sending it to actually do, first of all, are open for submissions, that you're following the submission guidelines, and that they represent the type of book, or they publish the type of book that you are submitting, because that can be very tricky. We'll start drafting again. 3 I think would be too few. Definitely get back to it. And the thing is about when you do come to the submitting stage, people in publishing can really tell if it's an early draft, and they can see bits that need to be fixed. One of the things I'm going to be talking about, one of the things I'd like you to think about for homework, inverted commas, is something called showing, not telling. And there's quite a lot of articles on writing.ie about showing, not telling. And there's a couple of big things mistakes we tend to make in this early draft. So basically, you're producing a hot mess, and then you're starting to redraft. Is that the showing, not telling is a big thing, where you are telling us too much of the story and not showing us. Often you can have a cast of too many characters, and well, this is good. This is great to see how everybody's doing. And often you can have too many characters, or you've maybe introduced a minor character and you've given us a whole ton of backstory about that character. They're all things that happen in those early drafts, and it's only when you get to redrafting that you start to spot those, and you start to read it as a reader, I suppose, as opposed to a writer. My agent and everybody in the industry actually suggests putting it away for a couple of months before you even start to go back to do the second draft. That is nearly impossible because the story's like burning in your head. I know how difficult that is, but do if you can take a week off from it, and then come back to it, you'll see it with completely different eyes. And also another tip, Paul, for you and for anybody else who's in that situation: print it off. So if you've done 3 drafts, make sure one of those drafts is a printed draft, because on the page you see completely different version to the thing what's on the screen. And I have, just looking for one here, this is actually a notebook, but I'll show you what I do. I get my drafts printed. I go to see the spiral binding on this. I actually have the biggest shelf ever of these over there, and you can see those on the Sam Blake website too. But I go to somewhere like Snap or somewhere like that, and I get them to print it out, A4, so it's really big, and 2 double-sided and spiral bound, so it actually feels like a book. And then I read that through with my red pen, and I go through and I correct all the mistakes, because there's always loads of mistakes. So definitely make that part of that process. Sorry, I'm just going to go back through your find out where everybody is. Where are we? Total fear of slump. Yes, so don't worry, a bit of scaffolding and you won't have that slump, because you can control the situation before you even start. And that's just have the confidence that it's going to be fine in the end. And yeah, 20,000 words into a 4th book, definite pantster. So much I've written first and last. Oh, that's great. And then fill in the in between. That's brilliant. Like filling in. Sorry, who is it? Sorry, use your name. Linda. Yeah. So yeah, working out what happens at the end. You know where you're going, and you're working through that process. And hopefully you'll find that you're developing those characters along the way. And absolutely, if you can at this point, if you're on book 4, start creating character Bible. Go back over the books. I tried to do this. I had my elder teen start on Little Bones, and actually they said, I'm stopping here, you've too many characters, there's too many different people's names, and there's just, and that's only book 1 of 5. So yeah, do make sure you do that, because if one day you might find that they're suddenly all published and actually you've ended up repeating people's names, because there are names that stick with us. And it's Lily Power, who's in Keep Your Eyes on Me, and Rob Power, who is in the other book, who are now cousins, remarkably. And Alice is saying, yeah, she's hobbled by the truth. Very useful thing to think about, as have done years of research around my characters. Always a fascinating period. Irish Civil War, locations in Munich, San Francisco, Dublin. Yeah. Oh, yeah, you can get hobbled by too much research too, definitely. It's really strange because, in fact, when you do a lot of research, you will only use about 15% of the research that you do when it comes to writing the book. So if you find, and also, like I did a history degree, so I'm fascinated by everything. I just loved research. But what can happen is that you end up going down literally down a rabbit hole. So when I'm talking about scaffolding, I'm talking about planning these characters and stuff. There becomes an important point where you stop with the scaffolding and you start with the writing, and you can leave a gap. If you're writing something and you don't know the answer, don't worry, just leave a gap. In the book that I'm writing, I think it's this one actually at the moment, having done the hot mess draft 1, I went back over it to write draft 2, and discovered in draft 2 that I had a whole chapter that said Alex chapter goes in here. And I'm like, I have no idea what this chapter is going to be about or why it's in there. And but it literally, because I needed to keep moving with the story and keep the momentum going, I just left a gap. You can leave a gap if you need to put somebody's age in but you've forgotten it, or somebody's name in but you've forgotten it. Or I'm just looking up antidotes for cane toad poisoning this morning, because I'd left a gap there, and that's something that I needed to go back and check. So try not to get too hobbled by the research, because it is fascinating. Yeah, you can do tons. Useful sites for police procedural and forensic info for Linda here. Yes, let's just think there. If you get really stuck in terms of procedure, if it depends whether it's UK or Irish, you'll find there's a guy called Graham Bartlett, who is a procedural advisor. He's an ex-British policeman, and his site has some really useful stuff on it. It has also a really useful list of bloopers and mistakes that people make in police procedurals. basically Google is your go-to with this, because there's no one site where you'll find everything, because literally whatever it is you're researching will be, there could be a million different permutations on that. But if you go to Google, there's lots of American sites in terms of gunshots. There's lots of academic papers written by people. So definitely, dig deep into Google and play with your search terms to find out what you want. It really depends what your question is in terms of where to go. But Graham is great. And there's also a really great Facebook group that I forgot the title of, called Crime Writers and can't remember. If you go into Facebook and you put crime writers into Facebook and look for the groups, one of them is run by an ex-American police officer, and basically he has a whole ton of law enforcement professionals and lots of American ones, which can be very useful on this Facebook group. The name will come to me in a minute. And you can literally go in and ask a question, and you'll get an expert who will tell you what happens, with if a particular gun's fired, or what type of gun it would be, and that can be really, really handy. But yeah, one of the things about writing crime, particularly certainly for me, for anybody else, is to make sure your facts are correct, because one of the things about you guys as readers is that you read lots of stuff, and when something's wrong. Particularly if you're watching lots of crime dramas, or lots of reading lots of police procedurals, when something's not right, and it jerks you out the story. So as an author, you have really a contract with your readers to try and deliver the correct information. And if you do make a mistake, they will call you out on it. You'll find that there will be an Amazon review where they say, I have a mistake that a copy editor didn't put. It was entirely my own fault, but in Little Bones. And I think I put, this is a different example, it's not a criminal one, but I put, what did I do? I can't remember if it was Cleary's or Arnett's on the wrong road. So I put one of them on the opposite. I switched them around basically. But because I had a British copy editor on that one, they didn't realise, and it all sounded fine. But it was only when somebody read it, an Irish reader read it, and they left the thing on the Amazon review saying, "Oh, I think you've got this in the wrong place." So make sure you do enough research to make sure that it sounds true. So what stages are other people at? You're all getting going, hopefully. Basically, the redrafting process is key to this. So it doesn't matter what happens in that first draft, but you just want to basically try and get to the end of it. And as I say, don't worry about it. Don't be frightened, because nobody ever needs to see it. Ever. Nobody will see that first draft, because it will change so much by the time you've been over it, many times, that it will have transformed. You might change characters, you might take characters out, you might put characters in. You need to make sure that you've got that hook at the beginning of the story. One of the things for you, Paul, to look at, and for anybody else who's on a draft where they've got to the end and maybe was on a subsequent draft, look at where your story starts. It's really important that your story starts right before the action begins. So when you have it finished and you're going back to the beginning, we talk about in publishing, everybody, or it used to be that agents wanted to see the first 3 chapters of your book, and quite a lot of people would write 3 chapters and then start sending it off. But what can actually happen when you start with your first draft is that it takes you a few chapters to write your way into the story, and those chapters actually won't end up being your first 3 chapters. So it's absolutely vital that you finish your book and you go over and you draft and you redraft before anybody sees it, because you want to work out what the story is and where it begins, and make sure that for the reader you start in a really, you're really bang, you start right before the action begins. And sometimes that means it's very painful, but sometimes that means deleting chapters, and that it sounds horrific, because there's so much pain goes into writing them in the first place. But don't worry, save them in a draft, in a new draft, because you will find that you may well go back to those chapters and you use them again. I always save my drafts, each draft, with the date that I'm working on it. Particularly as I get towards the end and I start redrafting, so that not so much when I'm writing the first draft, but when I get to the end and I go back in and I'm making changes, I'll save each subsequent change each day under the date. So I've got, say, Little Bones. There must be 50 drafts of Little Bones with the date on it. So that it just means that if I then decide, if I've moved forwards in the story and then thought, oh God, I really needed that paragraph I deleted on Tuesday, I can go back to Monday's draft and I can find the paragraph and I can reinstate it. And as I say, nothing's ever wasted in writing. I literally took out, there was a paragraph when I first started writing Little Bones. Nearly one of the early chapters I wrote was about Zoe, this artist who is in her studio, and it's dark and there's trees outside. And that prologue, I think it was a prologue at the time, actually never ended up in the book. It ended up being one paragraph in chapter 3. But I kept the original piece because I really loved it and I really enjoyed writing it. And in fact, about a paragraph from that original prologue actually went into the dark room. When I'm describing, I think it's chapter 18, the dark room, I'm describing Caroline being in the boathouse and the wind's blowing outside and we're back to the trees and the sound of the sea. And so I was able to bring that paragraph, which I'd already written and been very proud of, from Little Bones right the way through to the dark room. And you'll remember it and you'll be able to do those things once you save them. So don't delete, and don't work on the same, just one version, because you might want to bring stuff back. Now there's a question here. I mentioned 100,000 words. Is there an average number of words or chapters for a book when a story is too long? Yeah, I find to keep things pacey that you want to keep your chapters short. So as I said at the start there, I tend to think in terms of 3,000 words a chapter and 30 chapters making a 90,000 word draft. But in fact, my chapters would be much shorter. I wouldn't personally go over 3,000 words ever if I could avoid it, because I think that's a lot for somebody to read. You have to remember that your reader has to sleep, unfortunately. They're not going to sit there necessarily and read your book from page to page, from cover to cover. So if they need to put it down, or they might be reading it just before they go to bed, and then putting it down when they go to sleep. You want to have your chapters to be a bit bite-sized. So my chapters would be about sometimes about 1,000 words, 1,000 to 1,500 words. And there's a great guy called Amit Dand we did an interview with for Writing.a, who writes 900 word chapters, and his are really pacey because the shorter they are, the pacier they get. Oh yes, David, that's a brilliant book, for Forensics and Anatomy of a Crime. There's some other great ones. Sorry, going back to your I was thinking about the internet, Linda. I'm looking behind me for a book. There's a great book by a girl called Amanda Lees, which is the A to Z for crime writers, which contains all the terms and loads of things like poisons. And I'm looking for it here because I thought it was on my shelf. Well, I can't see it, but I will find it for next week. But it's called, I think it's called the A to Z of crime writing. But Google Amanda Lees and look for her book. And David might even have it in the library there. It is called From Something Aconite to, I can't remember what it's called, Aconite something.
You can send the links on again, Sam, after the talk. I can email out these links.
Brilliant, I'll find it. Perfect. And we can stick it in for people because that's really good for crime writers. And it has everything like, strangling through to all sorts of things, everything, all the gorgeous stuff you need to know. I can see we are coming to the end of time, so don't worry if you need to go. I won't be offended. So that's a really good one. And there's if you're doing things like post-mortems and stuff like that, Sue, her name has gone out of my head. There's another one you'll have in your library. She's a professor of forensic anthropology, and she helps Val McDermott. And she was going to come to Murder One, and then she couldn't. I'm trying to remember her name. She's written a great book too. We'll put that into the chat too, or into the thing afterwards, because that's a useful one for post-mortems and stuff like that. So yeah, everybody's having to tune out because it's 2:00. So we've just got 3 minutes to go though for anybody who needs to hang on. We can stay until the end. Thank you, Sue. Delighted it was useful. We're going to talk all about characters next week, so I hope you can come. Not next month, sorry. So I hope you can come back then and find out a little bit more. But thank you very much indeed for joining me, and great questions. It's lovely to see where everybody's stage everybody's at. Thank you, David, who's appeared there. That's great. It's fun. Everybody's disappearing now. We'll stop the recording because I think we're finished up for today. We look forward to next month.